morning. Out on this fairly lovely Saturday morning. Running a few miles in on the bike. None of it's going to be particularly interesting though for cyclists, I don't think. Going to do something a little bit different today. I'll do a little bit of a awareness session, storytelling, let's call it, about cystic fibrosis. So for those that have seen some of my previous or more recent videos, they'll be, you might be aware that like 4 months ago now, 30th of January, my son was born, and has since been diagnosed with cystic fibrosis. And I'm not sure many people know a lot about the condition, although it is pretty varied. I'm just going to do a bit of a, I'm just going to talk through really the story of our first 4 months. Try and raise a bit of awareness. As I know that coming up in a couple of weeks' time, it's I think Cystic Fibrosis Awareness Day, or week, I forget. I'll caveat everything I say today that some time has passed since some of this has happened, lots of things have gone on. I don't necessarily remember everything perfectly. I'm also not medically trained. I'm probably going to parrot some things that I've read online, which may or may not be true anymore. Reliably informed by some of the medical professionals we deal with that things change quickly in the cystic fibrosis world. And so some of the things you read online are based on pretty old data and maybe isn't quite true anymore for people living with the disease currently. So I'll start with really Jensen's first few weeks, just so people understand what we went through before, or we and him, I guess, at the end of the day, before he was diagnosed. So he was born 30th of January. He was 9 pound 3, I think, if I remember rightly, at birth. Community midwives came out like, was it like 2-3 days after he was born, do his weigh in, check that he's, you know, not lost a ridiculous amount of weight, and he was, I think at the time he was something like 9 or 10% down on his birth weight. And so they rightly raised the concern. We went to one of the hospitals, they did some tests, told us he might not be drinking enough milk, even though he was taking on more volume of milk than anything that any online information said for a 3-day-old baby. They talked about putting a tube down into his stomach to feed him, to effectively intravenously give him milk, of which we declined, and ultimately it was probably a good reason. It was good that we did, because the approach they were taking was wrong, but that's by the by. We came away with some advice on how to feed him slightly differently. We tried that, still continued to lose weight, or not put on weight more than lose weight, I think. Just get past these people. That's where I was at. Yeah, so he basically wasn't putting on weight. Being an engineer, I was slightly concerned that we were waiting him at different times of day, depending on whether he'd had a feed or not, and he was on, you know, at the time he was taking on, like, sometimes he'd be on like 90 over 100 ml of milk a feed, which is, I mean, basic math tells you that's, or basic science tells you that's like 100 grams of feed, and if you've not passed it back out the other end, you're going to weigh a little bit more or less depending on the proximity of the weight to that, the weigh-in to that feed. But anyway, that's somewhat by the by. I think there's a lot of things that could be improved in the community midwifery process. That don't really change the point of today. So anyway, we had the heel prick test done. Which took a few weeks. We ended up back in hospital at one point again because of his weight loss and he wasn't putting on weight. Similar sort of deal, never really got the advice we needed, never really identified anything. Yeah, we got the feedback from the heel prick test and found they had cystic fibrosis. Which, so to start with, I guess cystic fibrosis, genetically inherited. Both me and my wife are carriers of a mutated gene. If you're only a carrier and one gene is mutated, you can live an absolutely normal life. You will never even know you've had cystic fibrosis, or you've got cystic fibrosis, that you're a carrier, because there's that much overhead in your body that having one suitable gene is sufficient to support the bodily functions. If two carriers get together, have a baby, and you don't know ultimately, which quite a lot of people have, you know, the older, I say probably over 20 years old now, I won't quote some exact dates, but may never had or the heel prick test that may have been done at birth or not long after birth probably didn't include the cystic fibrosis check, and so you wouldn't know you're a carrier. These days, if you have a heel prick test, you'll find out whether you're a carrier or not. Well, your parents will find out whether you're a carrier or not. But anyway, so yeah, both me and my wife are carriers. If you're both a carrier from rightly, there's a 1 in 4 chance that your child will end up having cystic fibrosis, having 2 mutated genes, which is what generates an actual live case, if you want to call it that. Forget the numbers for what the chance of being a carrier is if your two parents are carriers as well. I forget the numbers for that, but I'll point you in the direction of the Cystic Fibrosis Trust and foundations to find the data on that one. Let's get past these people again. Right, back to it. So, yeah, cystic fibrosis genes. Basically, there are several hundred, maybe thousands, I forget the numbers again, of variants of the gene mutations, of which they are categorized into several categories based on exactly how they affect the way the cells in your body generate proteins, or generate the protein required to shift. I forget what it is it's shifting, but anyway. Forget what all of the different categories are. I think the 3 main ones are effectively a mutation that generates pretty much all the right protein, I think, or all the right parts to make the associated protein to shift what's going on, but it fails to build the parts into a full 3D part thing. Sorry, our wording's pretty poor here, I think, but you can see a lot of this on the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation website. It builds all the right parts, or mostly all the right parts, goes to put them together, does the cell can't put them together, realizes it's not right, and effectively bins off that protein, and so it never functions. That's the first one. The second one is something called like a stopgap. In the strand of code, which basically the cell ultimately doesn't really know where to start or end making a protein, so it might start building something, and then there'll be a gap in the code, and well, yeah, it doesn't continue basically, and so it just bins off whatever it's just done. That's one of the other types. And I think the third, at least more common ones, is where I think it builds the entire protein correctly, but then there's some gate within the protein that doesn't open for whatever reason, and so again it doesn't function. So Jensen has, I think, the most common, one of his mutations is one of the most common mutations within the Caucasian population, which is F508 delta, which is one of the first ones where it doesn't build it into a 3D shape correctly and then bins the protein. And the second one, which I forget the numbering of, is it has some names associated with like a Jewish background, I think, or it's quite commonly associated with Jewish background, and that is a stopgap style. There's a lot of information about these online, and ultimately several of them are treatable now with modulators, CFTR modulators, and what the modulators do obviously depends on the style of issue. So for the case of like the first class that I mentioned, where you can build it into a 3D part, the modulators can effectively add a little building block, or a few building blocks into the proteins, and then the protein will build correctly, and it will bring that to the cell surface, and it'll be, no, I don't think you end up with 100% effective, but it'll be more effective than none at all. I don't believe there's anything for the stopgap ones, which probably makes sense because I don't know how you fix a bit of missing code. It doesn't build anything, it never actually builds anything worthwhile, the cell. You can't really fix what's not there. And I think the ones where there's the gating issue, there are also some modulators for that, which helps keep the gate open so that things can flow. So yeah, I think that's quite a bit of data on information on the effective variants as such. There are, as I say, I guess the key thing to mention is there are so many different versions of mutations, and I think they're always finding more. It's like there's a database online you can search through to understand certain types. Sorry, you're okay. On the other part to go that way with that is, whilst I think some mutations have fairly common side effects, or issues associated with them and what the effects are on the body, it affects every single person differently from what I've seen, or what I've read. So like some people will carry exactly the same mutation, maybe even siblings, and as they get older they find that like one of them for whatever reason is plagued with lung issues or respiratory issues, and the other one has none of that, but has significant gastrointestinal issues, or maybe almost asymptomatic. It's a pretty weird disease. But yeah, anyway, I think it's one of the most common inherited diseases in Caucasian population, if not the most common, but still quite rare. I think, at least as far as I've understood, it's probably becoming more and more prevalent because of the advances in medical science around it. Because people with cystic fibrosis now are often living quite a lot longer than they once did, having kids, and as a result, I think it means there's ultimately more, there's more likely to have more people with it in the future. Thanks. Thanks. So, yeah, right, back to Jensen, I guess. So yeah, he's got F508 Delta, and the other one, which I forget the numbers of. After he'd lost all his weight, got diagnosed with it. Fairly quick process. Oh, sorry. From like week 4 or 4 weeks old, I think. Fairly quick process of starting to get associated medication into him to start get his body back to something like normality. So we found out, I think, on a Monday, and then on the Tuesday we were in the clinic at Leeds with Jensen, getting a review with all the other medical professionals in the children's respiratory unit and cystic fibrosis unit in Leeds, which is a specific unit for it. We start learning a lot, trying to understand what this means for Jensen. Pretty difficult those first few early days. For all of us, if I'm honest, was a lot of emotions, but I mean, I think that's what you expect when you get this sort of news. But anyway, we carry on. So he was given Creon Micro, which is a set of tiny little granules, which are enzymes created from pig stomach, pig intestine, something like that. And they basically they break down the fat, because what's ultimately happening in Jensen's body is that because he's got cystic fibrosis, the secretions in his body are thicker, more sticky than a normal person's. And that tends to block things for the most part. It also means it holds onto like bacteria and stuff more than a normal person's would. So people have, generally speaking, people with cystic fibrosis that have lung problems is because their lungs fill up with mucus, which is difficult to shift. And because I think it's difficult to shift, at least this is my understanding of how this works, if any bacteria or whatever gets into your lungs, or chest infection, the body struggles to shift it. It doesn't do anything with it. And so quite a lot of people end up just effectively drowning in their own mucus, or used to. But then the other things it affects is any other part of the body ultimately that's got small orifices, which can be blocked by mucus, so the pancreas. So often the pancreas won't, or might produce like the right enzymes and stuff, but they never leave the pancreas because the tubes in which they should leave by are blocked. So prion effectively replaces what the pancreas should be doing, at least in these early days, and breaks down the fat for Jensen for his intestine then to absorb and obviously used to grow. To be honest, that's worked pretty well. Creon, the effect of the Creon is, I mean, he went from, I think when we first went to the clinic, because he was 3-4 weeks old at the time, he'd effectively lost 10% of his weight since he was born and not put any of it on, or more than 10% of his weight I think at that point, not put hardly any of it back on. He dropped down I think to something like the 25th percentile of weight, so he was way at the bottom, but had been born at something like a 90th percentile baby, which is, you know, pretty crazy. Now we're 4 months into his life. He's now slowly he's made his way back up to the 90th percentile as of this week, which is, I mean, at least based on what I've read, somewhat unheard of. Like generally what happens with CF babies is they lose weight as a child and never quite make it back on, and that is a significant effect on the rest of their life, because they don't develop at the same rate. They almost they end up underweight for most of their life. I don't think they end up as tall as they probably should do, but Jensen seems to have taken to the Creon really well, and his height's good, and his weight is exceptional now after 4 months. The other thing he's on top of the vitamins. So again, I think it's something to do with the way that the CF works. It means that the body won't absorb vitamins at the same rate. I think they were the first few things we did on, I think they were the first things we were given day one. We were also, I think, given 2-week dose of amoxicillin, which is ultimately there on backup in case he gets a cough, and then we can immediately make up amoxicillin and give him a 2-week give him it for 2 weeks ultimately, and get that bacteria off his chest as quick as possible, because it can be pretty detrimental. And I think we were on like, they do various different tests. So you've got there was a stool sample test, which they're looking for stool elastase, I might be pronouncing it wrong, which is ultimately looking for those proteins that break up the fat, and that just effectively confirms that they're not generating the proteins. So there's that one. They also check for salt in urine samples, which again is another issue for cystic fibrosis. They often they lose a lot of salt through sweat, more so than most normal people, and so they have to be topped up with salt. So I can't remember if that was the first appointment or the second appointment, if I'm honest, but the second appointment ultimately, at least by the second appointment, I think he was also on the top of the salt, and I think again in that particular one we'd, or it might be his third appointment, that one he'd had a cough swab to check if there was anything already on his lungs, even though they all sounded clear. Thank you. Of which they found that he had at the time a bacteria on his lungs called staph, which has a much longer name than that, a medical name, but everybody refers to it as staph. And that's something that's pretty common in the general population, but the general population will never know that they have it, or may not ever know that they have it, because the body will just deal with it like any other bacteria. But in a cystic fibrosis patient, quite work the same way. So he was given a 2-week course of flucloxacillin, a different type of antibiotic that's, as far as I understand it, pretty much he's developed in a way that's specifically target these sorts of things like staph. So we put him on that 2-week course, and then his cough swab at the end of that 2-week course was clear. We're good. But in the following appointment, there's like the cough swab that came in then, it come back. And so basically it appears that it would appear at least that he's susceptible to getting staph, which I don't think is abnormal for cystic fibrosis patients, in that, at least in later life, I think it just becomes a thing that certain people end up colonised by certain bacteria and basically just can't shift it. So ultimately put him back on another 2-week course of flucloxacillin to shift that, and then he's on a preventer dose for what would appear to be several years now, or will be several years, until they can start getting him on some modulators, and then they'll review sometime into him being on modulators to see whether or not his body is, now the proteins might be working correctly or more better than they were before. We'll be checking to see whether they can take him off it because the body's dealing with staph by itself. Yeah. So I think that's for the most part the medication side of things. A few other things you've got to do as a baby. There's a lot of things they can't do for themselves, and so we have to, there's physio you have to do to try to keep his lungs clear, and so that starts with patting, and they have these cups that you can use to effectively pat all the way around where his lungs are, which is intended to help shift the mucus and allow him to then get the mucus off his lungs and rid of it. And then as of this week, they give us a PEP, I think it's called, which is like a, can't remember what PEP stands for, but ultimately the idea of it is it's a mask that you put on for like a bit of time, and what the mask does is it provides some back pressure to his lungs and opens up his alveoli, whatever it's called. Yeah, when he breathes out, the idea is that pushes his, it opens up the lungs, and then as he then breathes back in again, they close up, and that's that movement of the air and the expansion and contraction of the branches and stuff is intended to shift the mucus as well, much like the patting's supposed to do. doctor. So to go with all that, which is a lot of Jensen's story realistically, and I'll give you a bit of background on cystic fibrosis. So how realistically does cystic fibrosis affect somebody's life, I think is the next point. So, I mean, as I talked about very early on, it really depends on how cystic fibrosis affects you in the first instance. But there are certainly some things that are done as preventers ultimately. So, and they can, you know, most people with cystic fibrosis I think these days can live a fairly normal life. They probably will have some complications later in life, but I think that's just a thing. There are lots of things you can do to protect them from getting bacteria, which I mean are the sort of things you probably do anyway, but it's just a little bit more important for the cystic fibrosis child, or if you've got cystic fibrosis. So, like, you know, avoiding stagnant water, or anything that's had stagnant water in. So, you know, I think wet mud, that's another one, or just mud, all the things kids like playing with, have got a high chance of giving or passing some bacteria on. A lot of people treat everything slightly differently, so I think it's quite common that when people have kids that have got cystic fibrosis, or they learn that they've got cystic fibrosis, they start changing their mind about what you want them to do in life, or how you want their childhood to be. You know, like taking them out of nursery, and never taking them to nursery in the first place, should I say, because of the risk of catching things from other kids, all that sort of stuff. We right now aren't taking that approach. But ultimately, everybody does have their own way of dealing with these things. So we intend for Jensen to go to nursery. There may be some specific things around that need to be done just to limit his potential exposure, but you know, can't protect him from everything. So we'll just see how that goes as he gets older, though, ultimately. A few oddities, weird things, I think is, like, I think the suggestion is that most people with cystic fibrosis probably shouldn't drink bottled water, which might seem a bit odd, but I think that's just because bottled water ultimately doesn't often contain any chlorine or anything like that, unlike tap water, at least in the UK. And so technically I think the tap water, maybe I've gone the wrong way here, I think. Yeah, I think basically that tap water is less likely to contain any bacteria because of the way that it's treated. I'm sure though there are lots of things that I don't know, and I'll no doubt learn over the course of his childhood. And so I might make this like a regular thing. Might do 6 monthly updates or something to keep spreading the knowledge. But we'll see. So I guess the only other thing worth mentioning is, and it's not really the primary point of this, or ultimately we don't have to deal with the disease, the condition, should I say, that Jensen has all his life. And so I don't want to make it about us, and it isn't, as I say, but ultimately I'm just going to mention how it affects us, just so people understand. So, I mean, realistically, other than now being having to you know, do all these things throughout the day, the you know, the extra time we spend on feeding him, doing partying, giving him the medication, making sure things are extra clean just to avoid him potentially getting anything else. It does take its toll, and then, you know, regular visits to the clinic, although now we're on something like monthly visits. It's much better than it was early days where it was weekly, bi-weekly. Some people take the approach to not go back to work, homeschool, so on and so forth. As I mentioned, we don't intend to take that approach. Some people make it a reasonably big deal at their workplace to avoid, you know, people coming in with coughs or colds or whatever, passing it on to the parents, and then subsequently ultimately passing that on to the child. Again, not taking that approach though. Right now, trying to just somewhat make it as normal as possible for Jensen and us. So yeah, I think I've covered quite a lot there. I hope it's been insightful, and people have learnt a little bit about cystic fibrosis. As I mentioned, ultimately there are some specific resources that are very useful, like the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, Cystic Fibrosis Trust in the UK, lots of information on their websites, well worth a look if you're interested. It's Wear It Yellow Day or something, I forgot what the day is. Basically the Cystic Fibrosis Day in the UK. I don't know if it's global as well, I'm not sure. On the 14th of June, I think it might be. Again, look on the foundation website. It's all over there. There's also like a walk it, wheel it, run it, whatever 5k thing on the Saturday, I think, following, which I think my wife intends to do. I'm not, just because the Sunday is the Yorkshire Mountain Bike Marathon and I don't want to tire myself out for that. I should probably have made the marathon a charitable thing, taking donations, but I decided that this year I wouldn't do that, just because it's so early days for Jensen ultimately, and so what I might do it next year, or I might do some other things next year. As charitable things for the foundation. But again, we'll see how things go. Well, I think I've done enough talking there. So I'll call it there. I hope you've enjoyed listening to me rambling on for quite a while. And yeah, I hope you might have learned something. And yeah, have fun. The next thing I'll post will no doubt be clips from the marathon. I want to use the GoPro this year there. Should be good for those that are interested in my mountain biking, rather than me rambling on about things. Although I tend to do that on mountain bike videos as well. So yeah, right. Catch you next time.